Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul+Strategy, and I'm Tosca. So, in the last 10 years or so, NGOs, nonprofits, civil society organizations have become, in general, more outcome-oriented, more focused on assessing and trying to prove that their programs and their interventions actually have positive outcomes. There are several external and internal drivers for this greater interest in trying to prove outcomes. We don't have time to go into that right now. The book that I co-authored, Between Power and Irrelevance, The Future of Transnational NGOs, has a chapter on this. But the field of program evaluation, which I am not at all an expert in, has surged as a result. Somebody who does specialize in program evaluation and who has thought long and hard about how to make program evaluation more doable, more feasible, and more attractive, especially for small and mid-sized nonprofits, is Chari Smith. So Chari and I met through an invitation-based network that we're both part of that is called the LEAP Ambassadors. She is a nonprofit program evaluation specialist, and she's a woman on a mission to make program evaluation, well, easy. Because after all, many leaders think that evaluation will be too complex, too costly to pull off for them as small organizations, and that staff resistance will be inevitable. But Chari is here to argue that this is not necessarily true. And I am very interested in the organizational culture element of what I just introduced. So that's what I want to address in part from Chari's book. And the book is Nonprofit Program Evaluation Made Simple. So welcome, Chari.
Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to talk about program evaluation.
And we are going to do just that. So Chari, let's set the scene by tell us a little bit about your work within the big, by now, quite big field of evaluation, why you wrote the book Nonprofit Program Evaluation Made Simple, and how you feel it stands out from other books in the last 5 years or so on the topic.
Sure. So I got the idea to write the book actually from workshop participants. I had been asked a number of times after I would present if I had a book, and the answer was often no, because that seems like a very daunting task to write a book.
Yes.
So as you know, so after I did a session on building a culture in evaluation at the Oregon Program Evaluators Network conference in 2017, someone asked me again, and for some reason, I don't think they said anything any differently, but it landed with me of like, well, yeah, why not write a book on it? So I settled in. It took me about 3 years to write the book. And the reason was, because there were these requests and because I didn't see anything else out there in the marketplace really addressing how to make program evaluation accessible. And I think to answer your other question of how does it stand out, that's what makes it stand out, is that it really is for the nonprofit professional, also early career evaluators, to really make program evaluation accessible, because there are many ways to do program evaluation. And I'm laying out just one, but I feel like it's laid out in such a way that it's accessible to anybody to understand what steps do I need to take to start doing program evaluation in my organization.
Got it. That's quite clear. So as I said in my introduction, I would like for us to focus a lot on organizational cultures in nonprofits and NGOs as it relates to the uptake, the adoption, the use of evaluation and data, and the findings, what we do with the finding. So first, I'd be curious to know how you define the concept of organizational culture, and then I'll mention a few dimensions that I think are always very helpful and see how you're responding to them.
Sure. So in terms of defining organizational culture, I really think it's Beth Cantor really defined it well in her book. And I think I'd cite it in my book if you have it in front of you. That's one, I don't have it right in front of me, but that's what stands out to me is the organizational culture is defined as a complex tapestry, right, of different behaviors, of artifacts, of attitudes. I mean, it extends beyond program evaluation, right? Organizational culture is what is really woven into the fabric of how people interact.
How people interact. I quite like that. Sorry, did you want to say more?
No, I didn't have anything else. I wanted to also cite Beth's book, and I'll look that up in a minute. But I honestly believe it's just weaving together how people interact, right? It's kind of like the underlying pieces that we don't necessarily see or aren't tangible on a piece of paper. So it's that organizational culture is really leans towards how people interact, how they respond, how they relate to each other.
Right, right. And we can put Beth's books, a link to that in the show notes. So
Oh, good.
I
Sorry,
don't,
Beth, I don't have it right in front of me, but I loved your definition.
we have both clearly credited her, so we'll make sure that that is in the show notes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so I recognize indeed this focus on behaviors and not just on principles, values, and etc. Because I think it's quite easy to talk about culture at in a very high-flying way. Oh, these are our values, our principles, etc. But actually, culture is much more about our actual day-to-day behaviors, right? And those behaviors
Absolutely.
that are widely shared, that are mimicked, right?
Absolutely.
That signal what is desired here in this organization and what is not, right? The classical thing, what does it mean to work here? How do I behave? What are my habits? What are my practices? And so for me, these shared everyday habits is what is, I think, what is distinct about culture. And yes, these habits are based on underlying assumptions, right? That are often unspoken, as you said,
Yes.
that are belief systems and so on, sometimes myths. And so we're going to unpack this topic a little bit more as it relates to, again, the uptake of program evaluation and the use of it, finding, right? Yeah, finding.
Let's do it.
So in your chapter, you have a whole chapter on building a more evaluation-friendly culture. You say, and that this is, amongst others, determined by the spectrum of where the organization is in terms of collaboration and motivation. Why is that the case?
You know, it's based on what I've observed in working with multiple organizations over the last 20 plus years, right? I started to really notice motivation was a key factor in an organizational's ability to move towards having a culture of evaluation. So if people were not motivated or not willing to engage in program evaluation in a way that they're learning from the data, that kind of kept them from developing a culture of learning. Because the motivation, like, why do we do program evaluation? Well, I also go into this chapter as well as about having a culture of compliance versus a culture of learning, right? So if people are not motivated to do program evaluation, one reason could be is that they're really in that culture of compliance, meaning that we're doing program evaluation because our funders told us we have to. And that's it. It's that simple, right? So they stay there. So it's hard to move if it's like, we have to do this because our funders are requiring it. Instead of asking, like, are we making the difference we intend to make? Because the way to know that is by having a systematic process in place, which is program evaluation, right?
Got
So
it.
to answer the other question around collaboration,
Mm.
I also saw organizations that had one or two people operating in silo, developing the outcomes or developing the surveys or requiring how data will be collected. That also led to things like intending to gather more data than what they actually can do. So
Oh,
maybe
absolutely.
this may sound familiar to anybody listening, that you administer a survey, you get back like 380 responses, and then realize no one has the time or the skills to analyze the data.
To
So it
analyze
just
and then to
sits.
synthesize, what does this mean in terms of actionable next steps?
That's right. That's right. So I started to observe, like, people need to be involved with the decision-making process of what to collect, how to collect it, how often to collect the data. And so that requires collaboration. So organizations that are highly motivated, that
Mm-hmm.
already have collaborative structures in place, are more likely to be able to have that culture of learning, or I also just call it a culture of evaluation. So the collaborative structure is more around organizational structure, the organizational culture in the organization, right? So they already have systems in place on how to collaborate on a range of areas, not just program evaluation. So if
Yeah,
that isn't already in place, that
right.
could be a challenge.
I just want to circle back to the first topic of motivation. To what extent is this a chicken and egg thing, in a sense that what people are motivated by in a nonprofit is, yes, it's obviously partially determined by their personality, right? Personality traits. It's partially determined by what is incentivized. But then we already get into the topic of culture, right? Because cultures send signals all the time, and they're often unspoken, but sometimes also explicitly communicated signals about what is valued in this organization, what is encouraged, what is incentivized, and what is not. So to what extent is motivation not partially steered by the cultural signals that the nonprofit sends out? You know what I'm saying? So what is the chicken and what is the egg here?
Boy, that's a great question. I'm not sure that I have the golden answer for that one. I think that it starts with people feeling like they are heard, that they are part of the process. I think it goes back to collaboration, because if
Okay.
that's happening, then people are going to feel motivated to be a part of the process. If you think about it this way, if you just hand somebody and say, implement this survey, and they had no say in what the survey is about, why it's being administered, how the information will be used. It's just like a top-down administer this survey.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think people are less motivated
Oh, yeah.
to do that, right? But if they're involved with creating the survey, deciding when it's going to be administered, then I think that the motivation is higher to actually see it see it all the way through.
Yeah.
So I really think, Tosca, that the collaboration and motivation are intertwined, which is
Mhm.
why in the book I have them on that matrix. They're related,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really important for organizations to look at both of those organizational factors, motivation and collaboration, because both of them can impact to what degree you can really facilitate a culture of evaluation.
Okay. So you also go in the book into what are the most effective questions to ask staff, leadership, and board for them to become more interested in and motivated to engage in program evaluation at all. Can you give me some examples of some of these questions that you think are helpful in that regard?
And helpful in terms of getting them engaged
Yeah, and motivated.
and
Yes. So
motivated.
I could give you one example if you want, but I thought let me first ask because I noted you because I thought it was a good one. But I wanted to hear from you first. Any questions
Well,
that you feel work?
I think getting them motivated comes from having the collaborative conversations of what are we expecting to have change as a result of the program we're implementing. So I
Okay.
think it's again related to motivation and collaboration are intertwined. So there really isn't a unique set of questions to ask to get people motivated. It's more of creating a process that is collaborative. So everybody has a voice at the table and everybody feels empowered to say what they think. So it really is a realistic as well as meaningful evaluation plan to implement. And I
Mm,
lead with realistic, going back to the example I gave before of creating a survey and implementing it only to find that you have nobody on staff that can analyze or synthesize the data in a meaningful way. You have to go all the way back to the beginning,
yeah,
to the planning
yeah,
stage,
yeah,
and
yeah.
make sure everyone's a part of that process to ensure it's realistic to implement that survey, right?
Right, right. I do like what you said in that first thing you said in this in your answers. What do we expect to see changed at the
Mhm.
end of a program? Where there are you would think that's a basic question that every nonprofit would ask themselves that, but I'm not so sure.
Right.
So I think that is an example of a good question. Um, so for instance, you have in the book, do we want to learn, grow, and change to help the people we are trying to help, right? Do we as a
Right.
nonprofit?
We, not me, do we? Yes.
Yes, exactly. Can we align what we need to learn, what we think we need to learn, with what funders want to know, right? So this whole thing of, can we ask questions to ourselves and then try to collect data to answer that as best as we can, that we ourselves are intrinsically curious about,
That's right.
yearn to know. I think that's what you wanted to pull out with the types of questions you pose in that chapter, right?
Absolutely. And I think you hit on a really important word, and that's curiosity. Like,
Hmm.
let's get curious. If something's not working, why isn't it working? I want to give you an example about program improvement. I worked with the Northwest Housing Alternatives. They're actually one of 4 organizations that's included in my book, Nonprofit Program Evaluation Made Simple. And the former program director, Julia Doty, and I, we created a concept paper that is on my site. I can talk more about that at the end, but it's a concept paper because she was so excited about the shift that happened in their culture. She
Mm.
wanted to articulate it in a way so it was accessible to other organizations to understand.
Mm.
So we laid out different sections, one of them being program improvement. And what she talks about is they went from having reactive interventions to proactive interventions. And I'm just going to do a little story time and read from the paper so that you can hear what she had to say.
Yeah.
She said, based on a household housing stability assessment, quick sidebar, this assessment is something that we created as a part of the program evaluation process, okay? So we offer specific services and resources that help the household stabilize, avoid eviction, and/or access opportunities for growth. Whereas our prior intervention strategy before we had program evaluation in place was to have a resident household approach us with a need. So now we are able to distill available resources to focus on just those that are most applicable and helpful to that specific household. So
Mm.
they're able to really be much more proactive about their interventions because it's based on data, rather
Mm.
than reacting to whatever the current crisis is or waiting for the residents to approach them with their needs.
Mm.
So it was a
Mm.
real shift on how they looked at how can we improve our program. And that's an example of how program evaluation works in action
Yeah.
and how it works in an organization that has a culture of learning.
Mm. Right. Um, Is it your experience, though? Sometimes I like to push back against one or two assumptions that my interviewees may have. Is it your experience that everyone in the nonprofit wants to see the outcomes for constituents increase? So are the incentive systems for all staff and the motivators for all staff, are they truly aligned with that want to see outcomes increased?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think that's why we develop those outcomes collaboratively. So often the outcomes come from the grant proposals. So we have
Mm.
grant writers, because it's their job to secure funds, create outcomes that they believe will fulfill that goal, secure the funds.
Mm.
But those outcomes are not necessarily something program staff are bought into, or program staff may not even be aware of those outcomes being in the grant proposals. So by creating them collaboratively, we have grant writers or all development staff and program staff agree on what those measurable outcomes will be. So to answer your question of like, are they invested? Do they want to see these happen? I think they are because they were a part of creating the outcomes in the
Okay.
collaborative process. And by being a part of it, they have buy-in, they have ownership, right? As
Yeah.
opposed to
Yeah.
it being just pushed down from 1 or 2 people saying, this
Yeah.
is what we're going to measure.
And in fact, it just struck me that for those staff that work on the kind of the back end of the organization, the services, right, that make the organization operate, um, for them it can be quite hard to understand or see how their work is contributing to outcomes. But by being involved in that outcome formulation, the aspired outcome formulation, that can be another motivating factor. You also mentioned in the book the importance of shifting the use of language. And so as a consultant, you wrote, I began to reframe the language I used to talk about impact. So for instance, when we talk numbers, I mentioned outputs. When we talked about the problem and where we felt we could affect change, I mentioned outcomes. It became obvious that we were an outputs-driven organization. Tell me
Mhm.
more.
That's yeah. I so often I'm stumbling over my words a little bit because I have so many competing thoughts coming in at the same
Okay.
time. So I get really excited about this because so many organizations, when I initially start working with them, what they are calling evaluation are outputs. Now, I do a disclaimer. It is important to track your outputs. It is
Mhm.
important to know how many people participated, right? How many service hours were provided. All of those numbers are important. It is also important to be able to measure and look at your outcomes, which are change statements, right? To improve a sense of belonging, to increase students' interest in STEM related careers, and some sort of a change statement, right? Where there's going to be change in knowledge, skills, attitude, or behavior. That's more difficult to measure because you're not just bean counting like you are with outputs. So to measure outcomes, you have to first define the impact you expect to make,
Mm.
and then you can measure it. And I'm going to use that word collaboratively again because it's so important. You have to do this collaboratively. You have to have everybody in the room that's a part of implementing the program, reporting the data, using the data. They should all be a part of defining what those outcomes are. And if I could, I'd love to give another example
Sure.
from this concept paper. So one of the other areas that Julia really saw a change in having a culture of learning was around demonstrating impact. And she talks about they moved from outputs to outcomes, right?
Hmm.
So program evaluation expanded our data tracking practices tremendously while allowing us to cut out extraneous data points that were not contributing to our reporting. Data points that do not convey the change in a household as a result of our intervention are no longer tracked. Outcomes come from self-reporting surveys, housing stability assessments, and tracking a daily resident service coordinator activities. So by looking at that, right, one of the mantras I have is really only ask for information that will be useful to your organization.
Yeah,
Don't ask for information, whether it's outputs or outcomes, because you think you should.
right.
When you're asking a question, when you're gathering data, whether it's in a survey, an interview, an intake form, really be clear on how that information will be used. And so Julia spoke to that, right? That they cut out extraneous data points because they realize, we asked for this, but we realize we're actually not using it in any
Right.
way. So it
Right.
saved time across the board, right? Participants are no longer providing it, staff are no longer asking for it. So
Right.
they're only gathering information that's useful in some
And
capacity.
that creates, that reduces some of the fatigue that can otherwise,
Absolutely.
because you see
100%.
those swings of nonprofits or NGOs who never collected much any data for program evaluation or other purposes, then kind of are through external and internal drivers are pushed to do that, go almost swing to the other side of the pendulum and start collecting lots of data.
Mhm.
That data is, as we said earlier, not really, the organization neither has the capacity nor the bandwidth to analyze and synthesize it for actionability. And it just sits around, and then people get very demotivated, right? And say,
Yep.
okay, what's the point here, right? So you see the pendulum in that case, in an unfortunate manner, kind of going to and fro. Um, so you also mentioned a case study in the chapter on culture in your book that offers an interesting motivator. You say outcomes helped us understand when our programs begin losing impact in real time,
Mhm.
right? This allowed us to be responsive and adjust programming based on service user feedback before the funding model imploded.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's an interesting one.
That's an interesting one. And I think that's where some people get a little concerned about doing program evaluation, right? Because it is a systematic way to gathering data to understand what is working and what's not. And so when you're learning something is not working, when your outcomes are not being fulfilled to the degree you thought they were,
Yeah.
it's an opportunity to step back and reassess and then potentially look at what can we do differently in our program model and then measure again.
But that is threatening, right? It's threatening at first to know that, oh, wait a second, we have assumed all along that this would be helpful, but actually we don't know. And what if we find out we don't? have impact.
And that's where that can be threatening, but I also think it can be empowering if you look at the bigger question or the bigger piece of, are we making the difference we intend to make? And if the answer is no, what do we need to be doing differently? So I think it really shows when people are transparent about that, it shows the organization's transparency and commitment to learning and to be serving their participants to the best of their ability.
Of course, but that's what we all say, right? We want to be like that, but actually, yeah, are we willing at face value? That could be seen as a risk, right? Are we willing to make ourselves vulnerable? Yes, it's an opportunity for improvement, but that's only like the second, that's only after we've gone through the shock of, oh, darn, what we're doing is neutral, meaning it has no positive, no negative. And sometimes, in fact, I think this area of work is under illuminated, if that was the right English. Sometimes I think we don't even envisage the possibility that our interventions could have negative impact, not just on a small kind of particular population, but just, yeah. So anyway, there is a threat response coming from loss of status, of course, loss of funding, but also loss of status, loss of face, and many other things, right? So I'm really curious how you have shepherded organizations through that. Oh my God, but what if?
Well, I think the what if is that we focus on, let's look at how you can best serve the people that you intend to serve. Like if your intention is to create a sense of belonging, and you find that's not happening, let's go back and look at your program activities, or let's do a focus group with some of your participants and talk about, what do you need to have a sense of belonging, right? So that there's a very, when I say collaborative, I mean you can invite your participants to this process. That's where it's a learning opportunity. If we start with what data we're collecting, that is program evaluation. I do not see program evaluation and your program activity plan as two separate entities. They are related. So what you learn in your evaluation relates back to your program activity plan. So if you learn something's not working, it's not just you shuffle behind doors and try and figure that out. You come back to your participants and share. This is something we've learned from data we collected. We really want to be sure that we are improving your sense of belonging. What do we need to be doing differently? What needs to occur? And then work with your participants on, where is the stickiness? Why is that not occurring? Or do we drop this outcome? Is this something we think we were trying to accomplish, but actually our program is not set up to accomplish that in the way that we thought? So remove it from your list of outcomes and explain why.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit also about the different levers, whatever the right English pronunciation is, for culture change. So let me mention several levers for culture change and see how you respond in the context of evaluation, right?
Okay.
So for instance, who is the hero in a nonprofit, or who are the heroes, and for what reason is so celebrating certain people for certain habits and behaviors, to go back to our definition, right, is a strategic lever for culture change. I'll mention two more and then see how you respond. One is the role of storytelling, like what stories do we tell ourselves and told the world, narratives, language and symbols, images, etc. And the third one is, you mentioned it already, artifacts. So material things in the environment of the nonprofit, whether it's in their office, right, in their communication material, the dress code, whatever artifacts may be, right? Those are just three of many more levers for culture change. How could you see them, or how have you seen them with your clients relate to evaluation-friendly cultures?
Okay. What a great question. Let me start with the hero. The hero is typically who invites me into the process, right? We recognize we need to do a better job with our program evaluation system. We don't know how to start. Can you please help us? So the heroes tend to be the evaluation ambassadors, right? The people who
Mm.
are already on board with the idea of data can help with learning and
Mm-hmm.
are divorced from the idea that the only reason to gather data is to satisfy funder requirements.
Right.
Right. So it's that culture of learning versus culture of compliance. So there's an understanding of there's an opportunity for data to make their jobs easier, right? You know, like what Julia Doty was talking about. We're not gathering those extraneous data points anymore.
Mm.
We're gathering data that is useful to us and
Mm.
that's realistic to gather. So your second piece about storytelling,
Mm.
I think that once we have the new narrative, right, in terms of developing the program evaluation process can sometimes lead to restructuring the program narrative itself. So when I get into working with an organization and I start to read about what they're offering, and I think, boy, this part is not really pulled out in their grant proposals or in their marketing descriptions. Let me give an example, and this is a little bit on the fly. It just jumped in my head. So let's see if it all comes out in cohesive sentences. But I've been working with Project Lemonade for quite a while. They're based in Portland, Oregon, and they provide a range of services to support foster youth. Okay, so they have an internship available, internship program available for foster youth. And in developing their program, what I saw written about a lot were the opportunities for the interns while they were interns, right? That's what they talked about, were the change, and that's what they emphasized. But
Mm-hmm.
in reading a lot of their material, they offered a lot to the alumni that have already done the internship, but then can come back for a range of career development opportunities, for support, for all kinds of things. And I didn't see that highlighted on equal footing
Mm.
with the current interns. So
Mm.
we developed a new narrative. I'm going to use that word again, collaboratively. So we developed a new narrative to really put on equal footing that their internship program is for current interns
Mm-hmm.
as well as alumni. And
Mm-hmm.
from there, we had the outcomes born of around, you know, to improve their career development skills. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it right in front of me, but essentially it really helped to understand it's not just about measuring the impact on the current interns, it's also measuring the impact on the alumni to
Mm.
understand to what degree participating in their program helped them long term.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful program with wonderful people, highly dedicated to learning. And so in working with them, they were already all on board with using data to learn. It was a matter of setting up a system to gather data so that they can do that.
Yeah. But I am curious now, so if that change in program, how does that program narrative now changed? How does that illustrate as well as further spur a culture of evaluation?
Because now we have the new program narrative aligned with the new program outcomes. So because we are doing these activities for current interns and alumni,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we're emphasizing both of them now. We expect the following to change. So it
Right.
changes the storytelling. It changes how they talk about their program because they're talking about the current interns and alumni together and then
Mm-hmm.
talking about the change they expect to have see. Now, I wanted to also address your question about the artifacts.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, so the impact model is what I talk about quite a bit in my book, and I do with all of my clients. And an impact model is a variation of a logic model. It's a one-page visual summary, really explaining what your program does and the difference it is expected to make. Tosca, I see this as like a cornerstone in program evaluation processes. You have to have that visual summary, and you can't just talk about it, and it can't be in like a long, dense, written out plan. It needs to be easily consumed by staff, your board, your participants, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And in today's day and age, having the one page visual summary
That's
that
up
is in,
desk.
yeah,
Yeah.
have it up on, exactly, up on your desk. I
It's
encourage
screensaver.
organizations to have it in the meeting spaces, share it with your participants so it's really clear and transparent.
Mm.
This is what we're doing, and this is what we expect to have change.
Mm.
So The impact model is also in the organization's brand colors. It follows their brand style guide, right? So it's not born from Chari Smith's evaluation into action company. It's born from them. It's a reflection of the collaborative work we've done. And here's a visual summary that explains what our program does and the difference we expect it to make. So when you ask about, I think that combines, and now I'm getting really excited. Now I think it combines with the storytelling piece, right? Because now I've had multiple organizations tell me that once that impact model was done, not only did they use it to drive their program planning decisions, to understand their program evaluation process and their goals with it, but then marketing, fundraising, and communications have all used it as well. I've
Yeah.
had some organizations say they have a big blow up poster of it that they have at their fundraising gala. Or they, it's used and that's what we want. We don't want program evaluation to be in silo and only living in one spot.
Yeah.
It permeates organization wide.
Right. Got it. Okay. So let me run some quotes by you, Sherry. I'm looking at time, how much time we have.
Okay. Their quotes are from my book?
No. These are now
Okay,
quotes
good.
about culture that I love.
Oh, I gotcha.
And I want to run them by you and have you respond from the point of view of how they could relate to promoting a program evaluation friendly culture, right?
Sure.
One is culture isn't what you say, it is what you allow to happen. So this is, around behaviors and habits that are condoned, even if they might be negative from some other perspective.
Oh my goodness, that is a great quote. And I 100% agree because I feel people can say things and their behavior could be the absolute opposite. It could be, yes, I agree to do that survey, but the behavior that oops, I forgot to administer it, shows that there's not a lot of buy-in if they're not actually administering said survey, right? So in terms of it relating to a culture of evaluation, you all are kind of get so tired of this word. That's why collaborating is so important, right? Because the culture is not what you say, it's what you allow to happen. If you have a collaborative process to create your program evaluation plan, what you allow to happen will be in alignment with that plan because there's ownership and buy-in because there was collaboration in creating it. So, I mean, obviously a key takeaway, anybody listening to this is collaborate when you're creating your program evaluation process.
Another one, culture cannot be a mandate, a top-down mandate.
100%. I think that, in our conversation today, Tosca, I really think that I am not in favor of it ever being a mandate because I think that's where we get to the common pitfalls of data being gathered, but then no one has the time or skills to analyze the data. Or you have the survey and it's been mandated that you do these focus groups or you do the survey and it doesn't happen because people have other priorities because it's a mandate. I'll give you one of my favorite examples around mandates in relation to culture. And it actually comes from when my kids were little, right? And if I said, you have to eat your vegetables, they weren't going to eat their vegetables. That wasn't going to happen. They would push back and be like, why? There had to be buy-in. There had to be an explanation of, hey, this is going to help your body work better. It's going to be good for your development. I know it's not as good as chocolate, but let's pick a vegetable that you like and make sure it's on your plate and that you eat it. So I'm not mandating that they eat their vegetables, but I'm explaining, I'm validating their feelings, which is so key to validate how someone feels. I understand you think program evaluation is time consuming and expensive, right? You have to validate feelings.
Yeah, you
then explain.
Book.
Yeah. And then explain why or educate as to why it's important.
Explain why. Yeah. We've there was a time when I did some work on how to create evidence-based cultures. So what I meant by there at the time is the organizational climate that is it happens in an organizational climate in which data are valued, right? and decision making is widely assumed to be based on data, right? So that's what an evidence-based culture might look like. And that in an evidence-based culture, we have champions, and you mentioned already ambassadors, right? I love that term, that have time to devote to driving that evidence-based culture, that are from outside, and this is important, outside from monitoring and evaluation and learning. So are champions, often with significant positional power in the nonprofit, who are not MEL people, so monitoring, evaluation, and learning people, not in that unit, but are from outside that unit, but are modeling that data is important, right? Champions who take the time to analyze and understand and use the data, including when we should not use it, right? When it's either not of sufficient quality. And as you know, sometimes also you have fundraising or marketing colleagues who say, oh, I want to use that data, but there's a risk of cherry picking data then, right?
That's
so
right.
we need to be really careful. And that will promote the use of evidence while calling it out when that new norm is not violated. So these are some of the ways in which I try to articulate what an evidence-based culture is. What am I missing here? What would you add?
Wow, what a great question. I don't know if I have a lot to add, because I think what you said covers so much ground, that instead of relying on assumptions, rely on data gathered in a systematic way to make informed decisions. So I think one way to distinguish the evidence base is like, we can't rely on assumptions. I get this a lot from people that are resistant to doing program evaluation of, we're already making a difference.
Yes.
Susie told me what a great, experience she's having. So one person, that's not a systematic way to gather data,
No,
right? Like,
no.
let's formalize that process. Let's really look at what's working and what's not working in a systematic way. So that's an example of relying on assumption. Right.
Yeah.
But if you want to really have an evidence-based culture, it's speaking to what you said, it can really improve the quality, the effectiveness, and the efficiency of all the services. And I think that once people get over that hump of whatever their resistance or fear or whatever it might be, once they get past that and see ultimately this process will make their jobs easier, because that's what I lead with. I'm like, let's make your job easier. Let's take a look at what can we gather to make your job easier. Once they see that happening, then they're bought into the idea of having an evidence-based culture. And they embrace and become a part of it without even realizing it. It
Sometimes
just happens, right? It just happens because I think a lot of people don't realize there is another way to have your culture, that your organizational culture, to embrace program evaluation rather than feeling like it's required by funders, like what we talked about before. So in terms of having that evidence-based culture, I think that people shift towards that. And once they do, they're like, how did we ever do it that way before? How did that ever work for us before? So they really kind of see that difference.
Right, right. Okay, so I want to ask one more quick question,
Sure.
and then we need to move to the end. So I'm really pivoting now.
Okay.
What kind of guidance would you like to offer to nonprofits on the cost ratios for program evaluation cost in proportion to the overall program budget size, right? I see everything from 2% to 15%, right?
2% would be a challenge. A general guideline, and this is in my book as well, is 10 to 15% of your program's operating budget should be
Yeah.
dedicated to program evaluation. And let me clarify that. That doesn't mean you take an entire 15% of your budget and hand it over to an external evaluator. That can also include people internally. So you want to think about the number of people that are going to be gathering data. A portion of their FTE is dedicated to program evaluation work. So that's part of where that 10 to 15% comes from,
Yeah.
is that really dedicating time, your staff's time, to the
Yeah.
program evaluation work. You may initially bring in somebody, it could exceed the 15% if you bring someone in to set up your system, right? But once that system is running, it's a good idea to set aside that money, because you're going to always need someone's time to analyze the data and synthesize it into a meaningful report in a way that it can be used, right? So it really just takes time to set up the system, but I think 10 to 15% is a good guideline. It could range if you are doing just a few surveys. If you've already got a good system in place, it might be less than 10%. If you really want to do a lot of focus groups, it could be more than 15%, but that's a good guideline.
And have you seen that to be perceived as realistic and feasible for small to mid-sized ones? I'm not pushing back, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I have in that, I feel like once they start, sometimes some people are like, wait a minute, that's X, 10% is X percent, like whatever that amount ends up being. But once they start to put that in their budget and maybe their budget increases to accommodate having the 10 to 15%, once you start to see the value of gathering data and it makes you more efficient with your resources, it makes sense to have that in place.
That's
So
a good
yeah, the
point.
initial implementation and getting that moving can be a challenge for some people. But once they overcome that challenge and see the end and see, oh, this will ultimately make jobs easier, which will result in a more efficient use of funds, right? Like if we go back to the work that I did with the Northwest Housing Alternatives and the program improvement example I already gave, because they were able to move from reactive interventions, which is what they had before, to proactive interventions based on data, they were more efficient with their time because they had data to make decisions.
I picked up on it. I found that interesting. Yeah, indeed. Okay, so with that, we need to bring this to a close. So
Okay.
where should people go if they want to learn more about you, your practice, the book, Nonprofit Program Evaluation Made Simpler? Where can they find you?
Well, I have two things to share about that. First, check out my website, evaluationintoaction.com. You can contact me through that website. It also has a number of resources that are free on the resources page, including the concept paper that I've been talking about this whole time. That is on the resources page of my website. Again, that's evaluationintoaction.com. The second piece is what you already talked about, my book, Nonprofit Program Evaluation Made Simple. And it really is designed to make program evaluation accessible. So you can buy that book wherever you purchase books. It's online at all the usual online booksellers, or you could order it through your favorite bookstore. But it also has a companion website.
That was neat. I saw that.
Yeah, the passcode and the website address is in the book. But if you want to see a lot of real world examples, I have a number of clients that have generously agreed to include their evaluation plans, their impact models, and a range of different examples because I learn by example. So I was really excited to have that be something available to the people that purchase my book.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. The way you've really thought through how to deliver the most utility actually with the book. So with that, thank you, Chari, for all those insights. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, then be sure to check out Chari's book. We will put the link in the show notes. Be sure to check out other episodes of my podcast that are about nonprofit performance, how to strengthen one's outcome orientation and evaluation issues. So, for instance, episode 7, 9, and 46 all address these issues, and you can find these episodes and more, not just on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org with the number 5, but also on my YouTube channel. One of the things you will find on my website is my newest offer, and that is if you've been wanting to have an advisory call with me, but right now you don't have the budget or the time to engage in a more sustained consulting and coaching engagement, you can now book a one-off advisory call with me directly through my website. And again, that is 5oaksconsulting.org. So subscribe to my email list through the site, and you will always be the first to be in the know about the next episode dropping. And with that, I'm saying goodbye. See you next time at NGO Soul and Strategy.